Hello everybody. Judging by the title of this video, you could be forgiven for thinking this is just clickbait. Is the BBC left-wing? Of course it's left-wing, you great doofus. And in some senses I'd say you're completely right. But I wanted to add a nuance to this conversation that you don't often hear spoken about, in that I'm not quite sure the BBC is left-wing in the traditional context. I think it's more liberal left, or more accurately, neoliberal in its output. By this, I don't think that they take direct orders from the Labour government, but I think the government and the BBC are part of a broader power structure of the age, namely the liberal regime. Now, as we've explored many times on the channel, the neoliberal order of the age demands you have leftist liberal cultural views, and when it comes to economics, it's a bit more neoliberal. This is why when you have the BBC's flagship politics programme, Question Time, you see absurdities such as this when certain words are used.
But enough is enough when it comes to pansying around on illegal immigration. Control our borders.
Did you just say pansying around?
Yes, control our borders and restore order, and that's certainly a policy that I'll be pushing for and continue to.
I mean, that is a word that is often used as a derogatory term for people who are homosexual. Is that what
No,
you mean?
that is exactly not what I mean.
That is exactly what that word means.
No, that is not what I mean.
This is a good example of the joke the BBC has become. A guy uses a harmless verb and there are two squawking women assiduously policing the politically correct language of the age and therefore overshadowing a much more important issue in illegal immigration. Yet the reason the host here, Fiona Bruce, is so comically shocked by the use of a word like pansying is because she's showing her supposed virtue and fidelity to the tyranny of the age, i.e. the complete obsession with political correctness, equality and diversity, even the most minor infringement of which must be met with outrage, with scorn and even cancelling. And this is what drives people so nuts about the BBC, especially its lead politics show Question Time, which is supposed to be an objective look into the mood of the nation, but we all know it's heavily fixed and full of subliminal messaging. Again, just take the example I just showed you to articulate this. We can see by the strong reaction of Fiona Bruce, the host, to very mild language, that the implication to the viewer is that politically correct dogma outweighs serious political issues in terms of importance. But there's also a more subtle element at play here as well. You may have noticed that this section is focused on why concerns about immigration are branded far right. And for the BBC, it's absolutely great when someone talks stuff on immigration, but then makes a politically correct faux pas, so the host can do their shocked face, the implication being, this person has disgusting views. And in turn, this sets up some leftist, liberal, radical loon to go on a rant about how they're wonderful and peaceful and their opponents are evil fascists who are full of hate.
Oh, you absolutely are a fascist. You're from a far-right party. Right. You're Nigel Farage. Let's just be clear about that.
Now, you might have heard a healthy applause after that, and this is why many people believe that Question Time hand-pick the audience. The BBC deny it, but you have to remember, Reform are crushing it in the polls at the moment. It's unlikely that they would be this frowned upon. Now, it does look suspicious because, as I say, Reform are smashing it in the polls at the moment. The latest polling says that they could win the next election outright with up to 390 seats. That's total domination. It's not just in the southeast, it's not just in the northwest. They are dominating across the board, and they're dominating because they're the anti-immigration party. Yes, I know that they're not the uni party, there are other factors, but that's the big one. Now keep that in mind when you see this. For context, Zach Polanski is speaking about why immigration is the number one problem.
I ever think it's the number one problem because you spend a lot of time spreading misinformation and fear to make it.
Now again, that level of response with whooping and cheering, when Reform are dominating the polls, it just doesn't really add up. So it could be argued that organisations like the BBC try to tacitly inform the viewers with regards to the correct ideology to follow, namely the neoliberal ideology. And as we all know too well at this point, the neoliberal system tells us that immigration is an eternal good. It solidifies our economy, it makes us richer, it enriches our country culturally, and we're just stupid, evil bigots who can't tie our own shoelaces until the immigrants came and showed us how. Of course, as we've explored many times, the reason our globalist overlords push mass migration into Western nations is, number one, so they can create a low-wage labour class to prop up commerce and industry, and number two, so they can confuse and divide Western nations so they have no unity to stand up to international finance capital. And in what is, you have to give it to them, a stroke of genius, they get the socialist useful idiot plonkers to do the heavy lifting for them by pushing forward this liberal leftist cultural ideology around equality and diversity, and anybody against that is an evil fascist. But unfortunately for Zach Polanski and the people on the actual left wing, they're never going to get their way either. The liberal regime will be happy to use them as a means to an end, but they're never going to see their socialist utopia become a reality. But to be fair, some of them do notice this, such as Will Hutton, he writes for The Guardian. He believes the BBC's gone right-wing, and I know this sounds absolutely unbelievable to many people, but let me have a shot at explaining what these people mean. The first thing we have to remember about these people is they're utopian ideologues. They're completely radicalised and they don't know it. It's all part of the post-Blairite revolution. Take, for instance, something like gay marriage, which is a complete aberration in human history, but to these people is extremely normal. And if you oppose it, you're not just on the right, you're on the far extreme, completely wacky right. This is why you only need to say a word like pansying and the whole bunch of them get their knickers in a twist. I mean, even saying knickers in a twist would get them worked up. But look, this is where I think the left have lost the plot and gone a bit wacky. Where I think they actually have legitimate cause for concern is on the more political and economic framing of things. And I must say I have some sympathy with them here. As I've explored before, I wouldn't really describe myself as a classic down-the-line right-winger in the sense of a Thatcherite, and that's largely because I've always been more wary of the market than celebrated it. I'm more comfortable with the right-wing romantics, the philosopher types like Scruton, or the religious types like C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton. Incidentally, I am quite drawn to Chesterton's distributist economic model. It seems a bit more humane to me, although I can see why people are drawn to the market, creative destruction, freedom from the state, freedom to be who you want to be, private property, and the rest of it. The only thing is, I do think it's undeniably corrupting, volatile, and to be blunt, quite violent, bringing everything underneath its remit, the national interest, spiritual interest, and even our cultural well-being, all fall beneath the whim of money power. And I say all of this not because I'm a socialist in the left-wing sense, but because when you stand outside of the liberal economic and political order, you can see that organisations like the BBC very rarely explore any criticisms of the system itself. So personally, I'd like to see a lot more challenge of the liberal or neoliberal political order, but we don't tend to see it in the mainstream media, especially the BBC. And this is what the Corbynistas complain about. Jeremy Corbyn's on your screen now, actually. This is him in the 1980s getting told off for wearing his jumper that his mum knitted him into Parliament. I actually think there's something quite admirable about that. It's all like based Corbyn. But anyway, the point is, this is why the Corbynistas called the BBC right-wing, because they'd like to see more socialist representation in their coverage of politics and economics. And while I don't agree with their worldview, you have to say, if it's supposed to be a democratic institution which represents the whole spectrum of views of the public, they do have a point there. And this brings us to the conclusion of the video. The BBC only pretends to be a democratic organisation that represents the views of the public. However, in reality, it's not really a hard left organisation, it's a leftist liberal one, i.e. it's culturally leftist but economically neoliberal, part of the overarching liberal regime as a whole. In closing, do remember this the next time you hear some smug mouthpiece at the BBC say they get critiqued from the left and the right, and that proves they're right down the middle. No, they're not. They're culturally left and economically neoliberal. That's why they get that criticism. Anyway, these are my thoughts as always. Do let me know what you think down below. Do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new, and enjoy the rest of your day.